Welcome to all of you as we begin our second lesson in studies in the book of Genesis. I would like to begin today by looking back at our last Zoom session where we studied chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. And in chapter 1, we learned about God's creation of the world in a series of 6 stages or 6 days, culminating at the beginning of chapter 2 in the book of Genesis with a description of God who rested on the seventh day and sanctified and hallowed the Sabbath. This week, we are going to be studying chapter 2, the balance of chapter 2, from verse 4 through verse 25, which on first reading seems to be a separate creation account. Indeed, there are some who suggest that the Bible was a document that was put together from other sources because of contradictions that they saw between the first chapter of the book of Genesis and the second chapter. We will have a chance to look at those two chapters to ask whether they are in fact two separate creation accounts or whether they are one account that can be reconciled and understood as being part of one narrative but seen from different points of view. What are the main differences between the story of creation as we find it in chapter 1 and the story of creation as it reveals itself in chapter 2? In the first account, we get a kind of a linear evolutionary description of God's creating the world. In the beginning, God created everything, symbolized by all of the heaven and all of the earth. Creation was an instantaneous event, and after the world was brought into being, God spends the next days separating, dividing, making distinctions in the world, and creating by the sixth day a world that we recognize physically as our own. And he culminates that 6-day period of evolutionary creation by providing a day on which we human beings, who are also creatures, can step back and can contemplate the universe and thus realize our relationship as creatures to God. The account in chapter 2, however, is a little bit different. It seems to be an account that is expressed not from God's viewpoint, but rather from the viewpoint of man. And because of that different perspective, because the story is told not from God's view, but from man's view, the story changes a little bit. I would like to go over with you 6 significant differences that I have discovered in chapter 2. And when we meet next week in our Zoom session, I will invite us to discuss how we can understand those variations, how we can understand those differences, and whether there is a way of reconciling chapter 2 and what we have learned the past week with what we are learning this week. These are the main differences between the two accounts that we are given. These are the differences that we find in chapter 2. To begin with, God's name changes in chapter 2 from the name that was used in chapter 1. In chapter 1 of Genesis, God is consistently and regularly referred to as Elohim. Elohim in Hebrew simply means God. In chapter 2, whenever God is spoken of, the name that is used to refer to him is not simply Elohim, God. He is referred to, and I'm going to use the word Hashem here. Hashem is the way we say God's name when we don't want to pronounce it. In chapter 2, the text consistently refers to God as Hashem Elohim, Hashem God. And therefore, throughout chapter 2, we see a different aspect of God revealed as indicated by the addition of the name Hashem. What does the word Hashem signify? How does it change our understanding of the word Elohim? These are topics that we will have a chance to speak of in our Zoom session this coming week. Number 2, there seems to be a different order of creation in the second chapter of Genesis than there was in the first. In the first, as you remember, there was a sequence of events. Light and darkness were separated. The waters above the heavens and the waters below were separated, and the heaven divided those two bodies of water. On the third day, dry land appears. The waters are confined to their boundaries. The dry land forms the earth, and on that day, vegetation begins to grow. The fourth day, according to chapter 1, the luminaries are created, the sun, the moon, and the stars. The fifth day, we see the beginning of life in the waters and in the air. The sixth day, of course, is the beginning of the creation of terrestrial life, culminating with the creation of the highest life form, the goal of creation, which was the creation of man late on the afternoon of the sixth day, or the sixth stage of creation. This very direct and linear approach seems to be questioned in chapter 2. For example, it seems in chapter 2 that man's creation came before the creation of vegetation, of grasses and trees and herbs. It seems as if the rain, the waters from above, were created only after man came about, not on the second day, but it seems as if the waters, the rains, only began on the sixth day after man's creation. In other words, in our account in the second chapter of Genesis, the order in which things were related in chapter 1 changes and leads us to ask the question, are we in fact dealing with the same account? How can we explain the differences between the two orders of creation? Chapter 2 also differs from chapter 1 in that it centers not on the creation of the universe, but seems to center on the creation of human beings. The focus of chapter 2 is humanity and humanity's place in the universe and the relationship between man and the rest of the universe and the rest of the world in general. So the focus of chapter 2 is different. Rather than taking a global perspective and looking at the totality of the physical world, we seem to be focused on the physical world as it relates to the needs and understandings and apprehensions of man. In chapter 2, there is another distinction. Whereas in the first chapter, no specific places or locales are mentioned, we discover in chapter 2 references to a specific geographical site, which is also demarked by the naming of certain boundaries, rivers, areas that indicate a certain geographic place. What places are being referred to? Why do we suddenly have an account of a specific geographic place, whereas in the account in chapter 1, we were dealing with the world as a whole and not with any specific part of it? In chapter 2, God gives a commandment to man. In the first chapter, God blesses man, tells man to be fruitful and multiply. That is a blessing, but it is not a commandment. We have the first commandment, not the first commandment of Judaism, but the first commandment that God gives to humanity, and that is found in chapter 2, where God specifically tells Adam, man, not to eat of the fruit of a certain tree found in the middle of the garden. The text does not explain why man is not allowed to eat of it. God merely says that if man violates this command, if he in fact eats of this forbidden tree, then he will become mortal, he will die. And so we find in chapter 2 a specific command, the first command, delivered by God to humanity. And finally, for our discussion points for this week, chapter 2 seems to have a different account as to how man came into being. You'll remember in chapter 1, God says simply, let us create man in our image after our likeness. And then he recounts the creation of man, and it tells us that man was created male and female. In chapter 2, we see the specifics involved, how God specifically created the first human being, and we discover that this first human being was solitary, was alone, that there was no companion for him. Now, what I would like to do at this time is suggest certain questions for you to consider before our next meeting. There are 4 questions. I will send you notes of what I have delivered today so you can consider them and look back at the text in light of these questions in order to have a more profitable discussion. The 4 questions are these. Question 1. Is chapter 2 of Genesis offering a differing account or different account of creation, or can this version be reconciled with the account given in chapter 1? In other words, are we looking at a whole separate narrative, or is it in fact just a different way of understanding chapter 1? Question 2, what is the significance of the adding of the word Hashem, God's proper name, to the word Elohim, God? In other words, what do we learn by the addition of the word or the name Hashem to God's designation as Elohim? Question 3, how does God's creation of man in chapter 1 differ from the account that we are given in chapter 2? And what does the difference between these 2 accounts teach us about the nature of human beings? And finally, question 4, what is the purpose of the commandment that God gives to man? When God commands man to not eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden, why is it that God gives this command? What is its purpose? And another intriguing question, if God did not want man to eat of this tree, why did he create it? And why did he then inform man of the prohibition, setting up, as it were, man for his first sin? These are the questions we will consider at our next session. I hope to see all of you there. Thank you.